Charge. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was born into a pretty privileged background. He and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, were from largely upper class families that both had some interest in politics, and he was what you might call a career politician or someone who's destined to go into politics. He was married straight after university, and he quickly became a figure in the political system in New York, where he was elected to the Senate. However, his life took a turn for the worst when he fell into water while swimming, or while boating, I think, on a lake just outside New York, and he developed a deep chill. This caused him to get a disease called polio, which no longer exists or is largely eradicated by modern vaccinations. This caused him to be wheelchair bound or crippled for the rest of his life, and you can see in the photo here, he's posing with a child and a dog, and he's in a wheelchair. There are many exciting stories of him walking up to podiums using two walking sticks and struggling a lot, and people being very, very impressed with his efforts to overcome his disease. And in 1928, he was re-elected to the New York governor, and finally in 1932 he became the Democratic candidate against Hoover. Because of the different policies being supported by both Hoover and Roosevelt, there was a clear divide in the 1932 election. Hoover wanted to continue his policies largely of rugged individualism, where people look after themselves, or charities helped and supported people, rather than the government get directly involved. And he still largely believed in laissez-faire economics. Hoover, on the other hand, believed that the government had to help the people and that the markets had to be taken control of by the government because they damaged people's lives. Because of these policies and because increasing bank failures had made everyone unconcerned, Hoover was largely becoming unpopular and he was not elected. However, Roosevelt is elected in November, but he will not be inaugurated until the following January. In the meantime, Roosevelt puts together a group of experts, and he drew from a very large group, academics, business leaders, economics leaders, and even members of the Republican Party who were his opponents, and he called this group the Brain Trust. So when he was able to start in January, he was fully able and knew what he wanted to do. His first action, pretty much the second day of the Parliament or the Congress, was to pass the Emergency Banking Act. And the Emergency Banking Act had two basic plans. It was to deal in a very, very short and quick way with the banking crisis. The first thing was the banks were shut down for a period of 4 days. And this was done to stress test the banks. The idea was that banks would be looked at, they would look at how many loans they had in their books, how much money they had in their accounts, and it would be decided whether they were good banks or not. Good banks or strong banks were allowed to reopen, when bad banks were shut down and were then controlled by the government from then on. The second thing FDR did was he set up the Federal Deposit and Insurance Corporation. And the purpose of this was to control or provide insurance for deposits. So this meant that even if your bank did collapse, your deposit, or the money that you had in the bank, was insured up to a value of $5,000. Now, $5,000 in those days was a lot of money, like $50,000 or $100,000 today, and it meant that it made everyone feel secure or feel safe. They didn't have to run to the bank and pull out all their money like it happened in the past. Okay. The final thing FDR did in his initial New Deal was to set up the Securities Exchange and Commission to regulate the stock market. And the idea behind this was that it would make sure that the stock market was being controlled by the government, not overly controlled, but it was being managed and regulated, so it wouldn't be anything such as insider trading or behind the doors deals between people. And the idea was also to prevent dangerous speculating. So if someone was gambling too much, or this buying on margin with stocks was happening, then that was forbidden. It also prevented illegal speculating, or where people had inside information about this. These three things were done to do one thing. They were done to ensure that people were safe, that they trusted the American economy, and they thought everything was okay. All these three things were done in the first 100 days. The other thing FDR did was he started to use radio, which was a new technology at this time, to have these fireside chats where he would sit by the fire and almost reassure people. He had a very, very great oratory tone, very similar to Barack Obama, and he would just sit and chat with people and talk to them about how their America was changing and how everything was fine, and it just generally reassured people. His next policies were to increase employment, and this is where this alphabet soup of organizations like the AA, the CCC, and all these other organizations came into place. The AAA had two goals here. As you can see down the bottom of the slide, it says the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and it was a policy of the Department of Agriculture. The first thing it was most to do was to end overproduction of food. This is where too many farmers were producing too much milk, or too much cheese, or too much beef, or other crops, and they were being paid to not produce things. So a farmer would have a quota of how much he could grow. Before he could grow, let's say, 100 tons of grain in a year. Now he would be given some money and he would only grow 50 tons of grain. And by increasing or decreasing the supply of food, it increased the price. The second thing he was told to do was to increase or fix certain prices for foods. So milk prices were set, bread prices were set, wheat prices were set. The last thing that happened with the AAA, and people were very angry about, was that farmers were actually paid to kill off their livestock. And people thought this was wrong when people in America were starving, but at the same time farmers were being paid money to not grow food. It's one of those interesting parts of economics. So, as I said already, raise prices the farmers got for their food, prevent overproduction of food, and next, the TVA. The TVA was set up in the Tennessee Valley, and its aim was to build a series of dams to provide electricity and irrigation for the Tennessee area. This was one of the areas of the Dust Bowl. The agency also replanted forests, built fertilizers, created jobs, and produced cheap electricity. And obviously, all of these were done by hiring people and creating more jobs. The next organization was the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. This organization hired more than 2 million workers, young men mostly, to do hard labor work such as replant forests, build roads, dig irrigation trails, and fight fires. Okay, so you can see them here. They're digging what looks like a trench or something, and it was largely young, unmarried men. The pay was not very good, and the workers were largely treated like, not quite slaves, but a couple of layers above it. They had to live in camps. They were fed set food, but it did reduce unemployment. It did give young men a job, and it pulled them off the unemployment line. Okay? At first, these programs were restricted to only whites, but over time they were extended to the hiring and training of other ethnic groups. Next is the Federal Emergency Relief Act. This gave money to state and local agencies to help the unemployed. So there would be a certain amount of money to go to, let's say, New York City, or a certain amount of money to go to California. And this money was supposed to be used to provide local employment. It could be picking up trash or litter. It could be some basic unskilled labor. But the idea was that it provided temporary jobs and pulled them off the dole or the employment line. Next is the CWA, which, like the last two programs, both provided jobs by providing money to work in public funds. So again, it's another jobs program, provided jobs for constructing public bridges or buildings. Next is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC. And this was to provide cheap loans to people who could not afford mortgage repayments. So many people, because the financial market had collapsed, the value of their homes had collapsed, and they were unable to repay their loans. This was to provide cheaper money so they could pay the banks back, and then they could pay the government back, but at a slower rate. The idea is that you owed 100,000 dirhams to the bank, and you used to pay the money back 1,000 dirhams a month, but you could no longer afford to pay it back. You might only pay back now 500 or even 200 dirhams a month, or else you had longer to do it. Okay, and it was in order to make sure that the banks didn't collapse, because the banks were the ones who owed all this money. Next is the National Recovery Administration. And this was created to make fair codes of competition to govern entire industries. They did this by setting minimum wages for workers and minimum prices for goods. Now, these things might not seem so bad, but at this time, these policies angered a lot of businesses. They felt that the government was telling them how to run their business. So, for example, if you owned a restaurant and you have workers and you're paying them your wages, now you had to pay your workers a minimum wage. And in America, this is largely unusual because a lot of workers live off tips because of the tipping culture in America. The second thing is you could only hire workers to work a certain number of hours. So maybe your maximum was 8 hours a day. Even if the workers wanted to work 10 or 12 hours, they weren't allowed. And this made the employers and the companies very angry because they felt that the government was telling them what to do. They also used words like socialist or communist. Finally, criticisms of the New Deal. So all these policies, all these alphabet soups, these CWAs, CCCs, AAAs were all introduced to provide jobs and increase employment and to protect the economy. However, people felt that some of these the New Deal was going too far. The first thing, they felt that the government had grown gigantic in the last couple of years, and that it was crushing people's freedom because it was forcing people to do what they had to do. The classic example there was the National Recovery Administration, because this was telling people what jobs, how they had to do their run their businesses, and how much they had to pay their workers. It even set minimum prices for goods. The second criticism was that government debt had increased ginormously. So if you look at 1932, the government owes about $436 million in debts. By 1935, this has risen to about $4.4 billion. And they're basically saying that they're going to bankrupt the country because of all these policies, these unemployment policies, these cheap loans, these unemployment rates. They're going to cost the country too much money. The second criticism comes from the left, and is basically that the government is not doing enough. There's still people unemployed. There's still people starving. You can see in the picture, this is a long example of a bread line, and this is actually taken from a series of photos where there's 3 or 4 photos. The other criticism is that it is too much, so there's no social security. Now, this is a criticism of the New Deal that comes later. So social security is the idea that if you're unemployed, the government pays you a minimum amount of money so you can survive until you get a job. Before 1936, there was no such social security, and people thought that the New Deal should provide that. In many European countries at this time, if you don't have a job, the government gave you a certain amount of money, but in America they didn't have this. The final criticism of the New Deal from the left came actually from the Catholic Church, and this was from Father Charles Coughlin, who challenged the FDR. At the start, he supported the New Deal, but later he argued that this wasn't supporting people and that it wasn't the Christian thing to do, that Christians should be charitable and the government and this charity should begin with the government. He was a very, very powerful orator or speaker, and he used to speak on the radio all the time to his people or his flock. His criticisms were eventually silenced by the Catholic Church. They were a bit embarrassed about him and his criticism.